Hello and welcome to Lesson 3, which also happens to be our Week 3. We'll talk about concepts of risk assessment. Our learning objectives for this week will be to describe techniques for identifying and analyzing relevant threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits. We'll also be able to describe the process of performing a risk assessment. Now, if you remember back in Chapter 2, I think it was also Lesson 2, our previous lesson, there are techniques for identifying and analyzing relevant threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits. And you remember me saying a few times that you must be able to identify the relevant threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits. And usually these threats will come in the from one of the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. And let me touch on that just for a moment. You probably heard in my last lecture to where the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure, you must know those to be able to identify where your risk and vulnerabilities will come from. So some threats and vulnerabilities will overlap into other domains, but there are primary threats and vulnerabilities that can be associated with a typical IT infrastructure. And so it's important to be able to identify those. And so basically describe the process of performing a risk assessment. And then we'll get into our key concepts, which is the definition of a risk assessment, components of a risk assessment, qualitative and quantitative risk assessment. We'll touch on that a little more in depth here in a few minutes. When to perform a risk assessment, steps involved in a risk assessment, identifying assets, threats, and vulnerabilities. And notice we keep coming back to the identifying assets, threats, and vulnerabilities. Those are crucial to any risk management plan. And so then we'll be able to go into evaluating controls and countermeasures. And so we'll dive into Chapter 5 real quick. And we'll talk about the key step in the risk management process, determination of quantitative or qualitative value of risk, conducted for concrete situation and recognized threat. And the risk assessment is used to help identify which safeguards or controls to implement. Not all controls are feasible or affordable. So you have to come up with some type of compromise because most companies have a finite budget. And so let's say Security Manager A goes to leadership and says, hey, we've got this risk out here, but we need more money to implement these controls, and that control. Eventually the leadership, the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, will say, look, there's a budget here, and you need to operate within this budget. And so sometimes the controls that we have will only operate or can only operate and be successful within that budget. And so sometimes you have to be a little creative. And so risk assessments are required for evaluating risk or control, and they're often conducted after implementation of a control. Why is risk assessment important? Well, one, it identifies which systems assets to protect, whether it's the web server, DNS server, domain controller, database server. Any one of those are critical to any IT infrastructure. And I'm sure if any one of them went down, it would cause a significant stir within the organization. You know, that's why you have failover systems, redundancies set up. So if one web server goes down, then automatically it switches over to the other. And you basically have simultaneous database synchronization. Excuse me. You have the simultaneous database synchronization. So if one of these web servers that you're having to use for your online purchases or whatever. Say you're selling widgets. Let's say web server A goes down, well then web server B should have the same data as web server A, and you can pull web server B and put it online and really not miss a beat. But no, those are some controls that are pretty expensive to implement. I'm sure most of your larger companies, your eBays, your Amazons, a lot of those will, Walmarts, Targets, a lot of these will have redundancies and things in place. So a risk assessment is important because it gives the insight into which controls provide the most value. And then we come back to the dollar cost that we mentioned earlier. Not all controls are affordable or feasible. And so you have to be creative and operate within a specific budget. Now, when the budget comes around for the next year, you might want to reevaluate your creativity that you had to implement because you had the lack of budget. So when the following year comes up and it's time for whenever the organization, they may do it quarterly or they may do it semi-annually, but most do annually, budget out for the year. And so you want to put a proposal together, say, look, okay, our budget was cut way short. We have this amount of IT staff and security personnel, but it's going to cost this amount of money to implement the risk, for these critical items. And so leadership will look into that, and they may or may not grant your request. I've seen certain situations, even as a contractor, back many moons ago for the DOD, the operating budget was on a slim, very, very slim budget. And so for 2 or 3 years, there were certain risks that could be exploited very easily. But, with the right amount of money and having the redundancies and different things in place, failover servers and all those things, like I mentioned before, those are very expensive. So eventually it happened, but until then, basically we had to protect the critical infrastructure around those. So let's move on to when should a risk assessment be conducted? So when evaluating risk, when evaluating a control, and periodically after a control has been implemented, excuse me, periodically after control has been implemented, that reminds me of the risk management framework where there's continuous monitoring. But before continuous monitoring, there was the DICAP process, which was the old process for DoD systems to go through the certification accreditation, or for short CNA process, to certify their systems. Well, in that DICAP process, there were critical controls that had to be tested quarterly, which means every 3 months we would have to go out and look at the continuing operations plan, the COOP, the business continuity plan, the BCP, the disaster recovery plan, the DRP. Every time I see that, I want to think of Dr. Pepper. But nonetheless, those were some of the critical things that we had to test every 3 months. Now, there were some that we had to do annually, and then, of course, semi-annually, and then there were others that we had to test annually. And so, but at the end of the day, after 3 years, when the accreditation process was over, or your accreditation was running out, or expires after 3 years, you would go through a new certification accreditation process. But usually by then, you've already improved your product, developed your product, and some of the controls that you were dinged on before that were not secure, or they didn't seem, or the certifiers that came out, accrediting agents, they may or may not like the controls you implemented. So usually a year and 6 months before your accreditation on your certified product runs out, you're starting the new process to go ahead and get yours renewed for another 3 years. Well, now you have continuous monitoring in the DoD with a risk management framework. It's a very firm framework, and there are many organizations outside of the DoD that are starting to adopt the risk management framework. It's starting to get a strong foothold in industry as well. And so basically, periodically after control has been implemented, it's always good to test, no matter which framework you use, whether it's the COBIT, Octave, FAIR, risk management framework, whatever. It's always good to test those critical controls. So the critical components of risk assessment. You want to identify the scope of assessment. You want to identify critical areas. And then you want to identify the team. That third one's a doozy. As we mentioned before, there's naming roles, R-O-L-E-S, not R-O-L-L-S. Particularly, from management down to the help desk person and all the personnel in between. So there are many aspects of the critical components of a risk assessment. But before we get into the critical components of a risk assessment, you must first know and understand what a risk assessment is. A risk assessment, also referred as a risk analysis, is a process used to identify and evaluate risk. Risks are then quantified based on their importance or their impact severity. These risks are then prioritized. And again, we go back to the budget, what's feasible, and what's practical, and a lot of times using common sense. Risk assessments are a major part of an overall risk management program. They also help identify which risks are most important. A major difference between a risk assessment and a risk management plan is that a risk assessment is created at a moment in time, while a risk management program is a continuous process. So let me go back and reiterate that. And so basically, a risk assessment is a snapshot in time. So here's what we have today, here's what we're implementing today, here's the controls that we're looking at. And so while a risk management program is a continuous process, you're always looking at your controls from day one to whenever the end of the life cycle of that product is. And so a risk assessment helps identify which safeguards to implement, and basically safeguards are also known as controls. And so you'll see those two interchangeables. I like to use controls. That's what I was raised up and trained for many years to understand them, was basically controls. But we can also use safeguards here. They're used to control or reduce a risk. A control may reduce a vulnerability, or it may reduce the impact from a threat. Either way, the control reduces the risk and brings it down to a reasonable level so that it can be managed. So as we mentioned before, any company has a finite amount of money, and so security managers cannot just keep coming back and say, more money, more money, more money. The line has to be drawn somewhere. So the critical components of a risk assessment, one, let's identify scope of the assessment. The scope identifies the boundary of the risk assessment. And remember, the risk assessment is a snapshot in time. So when participants understand the scope, they are less likely to change it. Identifying the scope of the risk assessment helps keep the risk assessment on track. The contrast, uncontrolled changes result in scope creep. Scope creep causes cost overruns and missed deadlines. For example, a web server configured in a network. So the server hosts a website that is accessible from the internet. Customers can access the website and purchase the products. The web server hosts the website application. The back-end database server hosts data. You could set the scope to focus only on the web server. Alternatively, the scope could include the web server and the database server. It is also possible to include both of the firewalls in a demilitarized zone. Basically, we call that as a DMZ. So basically, imagine if the web server was attacked several times in the past year. Some of these attacks resulted in the web site crashing or the web server failing. However, existing controls protected the data. That's the key there. It actually protected the data on the database server. Data was not accessed inappropriately or lost. In this example, you may choose not to include the database server. It's also possible to include the database server just to ensure the existing controls will protect against current risk. There's no right or wrong choice for what's included in the scope. Management can decide to include or exclude anything. The most important point is to make a choice. And basically, it's common to focus the scope on system ownership. It makes it easier to implement the recommendations. For example, imagine a risk assessment that includes 3 servers. Each of the 3 servers is owned by a different department. The departments may have conflicting goals and interests that prevent the recommendations from being easily implemented. In this case, a separate risk assessment should be created for each department, whether it's human resources, whether it's finance, whether it's your basic IT shop, your critical areas there. And so that brings us to our next point, which is identifying the critical areas. The risk assessment also identifies critical areas that should be included. This helps the risk assessment team focus only on what's important. For example, a scope could include a web server that we mentioned before, a database server, and a firewall. The risk assessment could identify the following critical areas. So you have the web server. When you get to the web server, you want to address all the elements of the web server. This includes hardware, the operating system, the website application. The hardware focus on any single point of failure, which is short for SPOF, SPOF. Single point of failure is in any single piece of hardware whose failure can take down the website. You should consider a process that regularly updates the operating system in addition to applying best practices to prevent attacks on the website applications. And back in lesson 1 and 2, we mentioned these best practices. Those are industry best practices. These things that are they're not requirements by any means, but best practices have gone through the gamut. They've been tested. And so usually when some people have gone through the process and say, okay, here's what doesn't work, here's what you need to do, those are sometimes very good things to implement on your servers as well. So we don't need to repeat history by failing every time. So if someone says, okay, you have the same web server that I have, but this didn't work, so you need to try this. And so that's implemented into a best practice, and so we need to very heavily consider those things. And so critical area, maybe the database server. The database server hosts about 20 databases. The risk assessment should include only the databases accessed by the web server through the firewall. You should definitely consider SQL injection attacks. However, you will implement the primary protection for SQL injection attacks in the website application. And so your internal firewall. The internal firewall controls all traffic to and from the internal network. You do not need to include all traffic in the risk assessment. Address only the rules affecting the communication between the web server and the database server. So when you identify these critical areas, you should focus on areas that are most critical to the business. Profitability and survivability, we mentioned that in the first lesson. And it's also, previously in this chapter if you read the text. And so the risk assessment needs to balance potential profits and potential losses. Losses that threaten an organization's survivability are critical. And just a little side note, buffer overflow and SQL injection attacks are common attacks for internet-facing web servers. And so, and one of the critical areas that we talked about in the 7 domains is anytime we connect to the internet, that is a high risk because you're connecting to other people's internet that may or may not be controlled by security controls that you would implement inside your network. So, so basically, some data is critical, such as financial data and customer data. Other data, such as public data, doesn't need the same level of protection. And similarly, some servers or IT services are critical. Other servers and services are less critical. It certainly makes sense to include only the critical areas. The risk assessment team may not understand what is critical to management. The team should stay focused on what management considers important. At the end of the day, they write the check, and so if they say selling widgets is the most important thing, then we need to protect the process that gets the widget sold. And as we mentioned before, the third item on here, the identifying the team, that's always a doozy. Risk assessment team personnel should not be the same people who are responsible for correcting deficiencies. And so basically you're eliminating the conflict of interest. So the example the book uses, an administrator that's responsible for implementing controls on a web server, his input may be slanted by his desire to implement the control. If disinterested parties provide the input, there is a better chance of getting accurate, objective data. This is not to say that you shouldn't get input from the responsible department. Its staff probably has excellent insight into the problems and how to fix them. However, when prioritizing risk and determining the usefulness of controls, input from the people who correct deficiencies should not be the deciding factor. And usually, in the DoD, when we went through the certification accreditation process, you had your people that hardened the systems, but then you had the people that come and check the systems, and then you would bring in an independent third party to verify that, okay, the system has been hardened by the systems administration team, the database team, database administrators, and software engineers and software developers, and then internal management, security, information assurance managers, which I performed for 6 years with the government, would go out and verify these things. And then you would bring in the third party, which is the auditors, and they would go through almost the same process of checking the product that you said is complete. Well, they'll come through and say, okay, well, we scanned the system, we've looked at it, and you need to work on these controls. Right now we'll give it a category 1, which is critical, category 2, which is a medium, category 3, which is, not so bad, but you need to work on it. And so those are the things that you need to keep in mind when you start to identify the team that's in the process. And it's like I jumped ahead a slide there. There's your firewall, there's a web server, there's another firewall, database server, internal network. You see the DMZ. All of that is protected on the inside of the server, so all the traffic coming in would be filtered by the firewalls. And so you see the internet cloud there, which is right here. That is the untrusted zone. Once you go out there, you're on other people's network, and basically that's the untrusted site, because they may not implement the same controls that you do. And so identifying potential scope of web server risk analysis. You can see the same slide there, and I think we've already touched on some of these. I just went ahead a few slides and jumped ahead of myself there. Now we get to the fun part, the quantitative risk assessments, and then the qualitative risk assessments. So when considering a risk assessment, you first need to identify what method to use. The two primary methods used in the IT field are quantitative. This is the quantitative is an objective method. It uses numbers such as actual dollar values. A quantitative risk analysis requires a significant amount of data. Gathering this data often takes time. If the data is available, this type of risk assessment becomes a simple math problem with the use of formulas. Now, the qualitative risk assessment, this is a subjective method. It uses relative values based on opinions from experts. Experts provide their input on the probability and impact of a risk. A qualitative risk analysis uses words such as low, medium, high instead of numbers. It can be completed rather quickly. I disagree with the quickly part there, because when working with the DoD as an information assurance manager, we would start the certification accreditation process usually a year out, getting things together, making sure that the product would be ready to go when the current accreditation expires. And so usually it would start a year out. And the method used there was mostly the qualitative, because we would use the best practices, the guidelines put in place by the DoD, the risk management framework, and whatnot. And so as you heard me previously say, the low, medium, high, category 1, which is a very high, category 2, which was a medium, and then category 3, which is a low. Category 1 means you're not getting the system certified until this is fixed. Category 2 means we can let you have a temporary accreditation until you get this fixed, and so we'll give you 6 months and we'll revisit this. And basically a level 3, which is a low, would basically said, okay, yeah, this needs to be fixed, but it's not crucial to your infrastructure, and so in 120 days or let's say within the year, you need to find something to put in place to mitigate that. And so basically with the quantitative risk assessments and the qualitative risk assessment, both of the methods are, can be used. As mentioned, the DoD for the products that we used was the qualitative analysis. A quantitative risk assessment, as we mentioned, uses numbers such as dollars, dollar values. You gather data and then enter it into a standard formula. The result can help you identify the priority of risk. You can also use the results to determine the effectiveness of controls. Some of the key terms associated with quantitative risk are single loss expectancy, and you'll see the SLE, which is the total loss expected from a single incident. And And so then there's the single loss expectancy, or basically an incident occurs when a threat exploits a vulnerability. So the loss is expressed in dollar values such as $5,000. It includes the value of the hardware, software, and the data. And then, of course, you have the annual rate of occurrence, the ARO, the number of times an incident is expected to occur in a year. Notice the key word there is annual. And there I go, getting ahead of myself again. I'll try to keep up with the slides. Sometimes I get to talking and forget to nudge the slides a little bit. And so your annual loss expectancy is the expected loss for a year, and the annual, basically the annual loss expectancy is calculated by multiplying SLE, the single loss expectancy, times the annual rate of occurrence. Because SLE is given as a dollar amount, ALE is the annual loss expectancy is given as a dollar value. For example, if the SLE is $5,000 and the ARO is 12, then the ALE is $60,000. And so your safeguard value, as we mentioned before, you'll see the safeguards is interchangeable with controls. And so that's the cost of a control. Controls are used to mitigate the risk. For example, antivirus software could have an average cost of $50 for each computer, and if you have 100 computers, then you basically have a control value or safeguard value of $5,000. So as I mentioned before, a quantitative risk assessment benefits, it's a simple math problem once all the data is collected, provides a cost-benefit analysis, and as you get further into the book in this course, we'll talk about the CBA, cost-benefit analysis, gives you accurate values for the single loss expectancy, annual rate of occurrence, and safeguard value lets you calculate the cost-benefit analysis. So management is often familiar with quantitative assessment terminology. It's easily for them to grasp the concept of the details of the assessment and its recommendation. So formulas are verifiable and objective measurement. The qualitative risk assessment limitations, the quantitative risk assessment limitation, accurate data isn't always available, especially true when identifying annual rate of occurrence reductions, and basically ensuring that people use the control as expected. And it may need to take additional steps such as training to ensure the users are aware of the importance of the control. So now we can get into the qualitative. As we mentioned before, the qualitative risk assessment is subjective, and it's a probability, the likelihood that a threat will exploit a vulnerability, and so the impact, which is basically the negative result if a risk occurs. And so basically using a risk matrix, matching probability and impact. So basically when you're matching probability and impact, you basically have a probability scale. As we mentioned before in the qualitative analysis, the low is unlikely, the low probability, it's unlikely that the risk will occur, threats are not active, vulnerabilities are either not known or have been mitigated. The medium, there's a moderate chance the risk will occur, it has occurred in the past, but mitigation controls have reduced recent occurrences. And, the high probability is there is a high probability the risk will occur. It has occurred in the past and will occur again if not mitigated. And so then you have the impact scale of, your impact is low. If the risk occurs, it will have minimal impact on the company. If it's a medium, if the risk occurs, it will have a moderate impact on the company, and the high. If the risk occurs, it will have a high impact on the company. It will affect critical data or systems and cause substantial losses. And so basically, qualitative analysis can be divided into two sections. The first section attempts to prioritize the risk. The second section evaluates the effectiveness of controls. It's possible to perform both sections at the same time. However, for clarity, they're presented as two separate actions. And so, so like if you're prioritizing the risk, basically, for instance, if you're doing a risk analysis, is to identify which risks are most important. You do this by assigning probability and impact values to known risk. For example, imagine your company website sells company products. Due to recent outages, you're trying to identify the most important risk to the website. Based on feedback from several experts, you have come up with a list, and you want to prioritize these risks. These categories are denial of service attack. So basically, any denial of service attack or distributed denial of service, which is a DDoS attack that results in an outage. Web defacing, which is modification of the website by unauthorized parties, loss of data from unauthorized access, any loss of confidentiality. So this could be from an attacker accessing customer data. It could also be from an attacker accessing any internal private data. It does not include the loss of public data that is freely available. And so then, there's the other one, loss of website, excuse me, data due to hardware failure. Action. So the best practice for risk assessment is to start with clear goals and a defined scope, enlist senior management support, build a strong risk assessment team, repeat the risk assessment regularly. For instance, continuous monitoring or, test your controls quarterly, semi-annually. Define a methodology to use and stick with it. And basically provide a report of clear risk and clear recommendations to management. And so now we'll move into Chapter 6, performing a risk assessment. Basically in performing risk assessments, you want to identify the assets and activities to address, identify and evaluate relevant threats, identify and evaluate relevant vulnerabilities, identify and evaluate relevant countermeasures, assets, access threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits, evaluate the risk, and develop and present recommendations. And then, of course, selecting a risk assessment methodology. We just discussed this in Chapter 5, which is quantitative versus qualitative. And so here we go. And so prior to conducting a risk assessment, you want to define the assessment, operational characteristics, mission of the systems, what purpose are they going to serve in these things. So So basically, in defining the assessment, you need to clearly define what you'll assess. If it's a system, you need to describe the system. If it's a process, you'll need to describe the process. And so it's important to describe the system or process as it is as it stands right now. Because remember, a risk assessment is a snapshot in time, whereas a risk management plan is a continuous moving target. So a risk assessment is a point-in-time assessment. It's unlike overall risk management, which is continuous process. So when describing the system or process, you often focus on two primary areas, the operational characteristics and the mission of the system. So your operational characteristics basically define how the system operates in your environment. It's not enough to just name the system such as email server. Instead, you need to identify how the system is currently configured and operating. And so now the mission of the system. Oh yeah, let me back up a little bit on the operational characteristics. One of the things you need to ask is after you perform the risk assessment against the current system, the current configuration isn't always apparent or readily available. It sometimes takes some digging, some simple questions that you might want to include in your risk assessments. Basically, do you have current diagrams that show all of the current systems? Do you have documentation of the current configuration? So that way it lets you know the hardware, it lets you know the operating system, it lets you know the software that's installed on it, the whole kit and caboodle, as some people would say, the whole 9 yards. And so then you want to define the mission of the system. The mission of the system defines what the system does. Compared with the operational characteristics of the system, the mission is easy to define. So the mission definition for any single system can be short as a paragraph or a single page, a short memo type thing. So it can also consist of simple bullet statements. For example, an email server could have the following mission. Routing emails between internal clients, accepting email from external email servers or routing to internal clients, accepting email from internal clients and routing to external email servers, scanning all email attachments and removing malware, scanning all email for spam, and stripping out confirmed spam. And so then you get down to the review previous findings. If previous audits of risk assessments are available, you should review them. Basically, to see how far you've, how much time or what kind of progress have you made from the last assessment. And so these reports can contain a lot of valuable information, basically to make your job easier. And the reports list assets, threats, and vulnerabilities. They should also list controls currently in place. They may provide recommendations for additional controls. So 3 items, basically are worth investigating. And, basically the recommendations. So previous recommendations giving insight to several issues. They address threats and vulnerabilities considered relevant at the time. They also include controls considered valuable at the time. Even though many issues may have changed, some may be similar or the same. And then so the current status of accepted recommendations. It's always a good idea, all accepted previous recommendations that are in place. You can then measure the effectiveness of approved and implemented recommendations. However, if an approved recommendation isn't in place, the previous report may help you determine the reason why. Perhaps the hardware or software is still in the purchasing pipeline. Maybe the approved recommendation was simply ignored. And so then you have the unapproved recommendations. The recommendations that were not approved can also give some insight into the business. They may indicate that the organization is willing to accept a higher level of residual risk. And so the organization could have suffered losses that would have been mitigated by an unapproved control. If that's true, management may be more receptive to the control at this time. And so identifying the management structure, refers to how responsibilities are assigned. It's always helpful to keep the scope within the ownership of a single entity. So the management structure refers to how responsibilities are going to be assigned. So when you define the scope of the risk assessment, it's helpful to keep the scope within the ownership of a single entity. This basically allows for easier implementation of recommendations. A small organization may have a single information technology division, an IT division. And so because its IT staff, is small, they can implement recommendations for any of the systems. But larger organizations may have multiple IT divisions that specifically, in this case, various managers or management teams oversee different IT systems. So each manager has different responsibilities. For example, an organization may have the following divisions for IT. There's the network infrastructure, user and computer management, email servers, web servers, database servers, configuration and change management. Whereas a small organization may perform a risk assessment for many systems at the same time, a larger organization will likely separate the risk assessments, based on the needs from each of the departments. So identifying assets and activities. Perform asset valuation based on replacement or recovery value of the asset. You want to ensure that the risk assessment performed on current systems. Evaluate only assets that are within the boundary of the risk assessment. Remember, we talked earlier about the scope in Chapter 5. Clearly define your scope and stay on mission. This is what we're looking at, and this is the risk assessment. Remember, the snapshot in time. That's what we're looking at now. And then you want to be able to prioritize your importance. And so basically your replacement value, this is the cost to purchase a new asset in its place. For example, if a laptop fails or if it's stolen, the price of the purchase of a new laptop with similar hardware or software, it may be $3,000. And so then you want to look at the recovery value. That's the cost to get the asset operational after a failure. For example, if the hard drive on a server fails, you wouldn't want to replace the entire server. Instead, you would replace the hard drive and take steps to recover the system. This may require you to reinstall the operating system and restore data from a backup. You would also consider the time needed to perform the repair. So for an example, if a repair requires 2 hours, the system is not available for 2 hours. If it's the web server generating $10,000 an hour in revenue, you would include $20,000 as part of the recovery value. Then you want to, some of the things you want to consider when determining the asset value. Access and availability, basically refers to how and when the asset needs to be available. Some assets need to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Other assets only need to be available Monday through Friday during business hours. The more available the asset needs to be, the more risk you have basically related to the outages. So let's consider a web server used to sell products over the internet. Customers may access the website at any time. If the website is not operational, when the customer tries to access it, you have lost basically you've lost a sale. So you may have a lost customer. And basically establishing a new customer and a new customer trust, as we discussed in previous lessons, is harder. So you want to maintain your current customers and maintain their trust, and because they're going to keep coming back to you. And so basically keeping that in mind, the risk assessment needs to consider the risk associated with this web site going down at any given time. Additionally, you need to consider how to perform maintenance on the system without taking the website down. This includes performing backups of the data. It also includes keeping the system up to date. Your system functions, basically if a system provides a service, you should consider the functions of the system when determining the asset's value. Particular importance is how the functions are performed, manual or through automation. So for example, imagine you're evaluating the value of email in your organization. Your email system could have multiple elements, including a spam filter. Studies report that as much as 90% of the emails sent through the internet is spam. So spam filters will eliminate some of the spam with a goal of not eliminating any valid emails. So basically a spam filter that filters out as much as 30% of the spam provides a significant reduction in unwanted email with a high assurance that valid emails isn't filtered. And so so basically, what is the value of the spam filter? It uses an automated process, so the value is simply the value of the appliance. If it breaks or malfunctions, you can replace it. However, some spam filters require much more interaction. You could have dedicated technicians who are constantly viewing the filtered spam to ensure it doesn't include any valid emails. These technicians could be adding valid email source addresses to whitelist. They also could be added, known spammers or backlists. So basically, you have your automation, and then you have your automation slash manual process there. And so your hardware and software assets, those are basically any assets that you can physically touch. This includes computers such as laptops, workstations, and servers. It also includes network devices such as routers, switches, and firewalls. There's a wide range of value among the devices. A simple PC can cost less than $500. However, a high-end server can cost tens of thousands of dollars. And same thing with routers and switches. If you get up with the ones that have all the bells and whistles, you're going to pay a pretty penny for it. And so basically, your personnel assets, those are, those are the people that make the business run. And so an organization that is able to retain personnel often, they basically have fewer problems than organizations with a high turnover rate, because basically with a high turnover rate, you're always training new employees, and by the time they're trained and let's say they leave, then you're back to the training process again. But if you can retain employees, then you're back to the institutional knowledge of the organization. And so basically, if you can hang on to your personnel, then do so. Basically, what kind of benefits are you offering? There was a company that I worked for as a contractor at Redstone Arsenal. They were a company, they low bid the contract. And so basically, they had no leave. you had like 1 week per year. That was it. And so to compensate for that, the government allowed us to work the alternate work schedule, which is 9/8, and so every other Friday we were off. So that would give you 26 additional days. And sometimes you would be able to swap your AWS day, if you had a doctor's appointment and that kind of stuff. But there was a high turnover rate because many of them would leave for the same pay, but a lot better benefit, more benefits, and basically for more leave. When I mentioned the 7 days or the 1 week, that included sick leave as well. So you see how low that was, the contract was bid. And so there was a high turnover rate during that time. And so fortunately, when the contract came up for bid, there was a company that came in and overbid everything 30%. And that was a blessing because, you had the good 401k package, you had educational reimbursement, you had, you could have up to 5 weeks of leave if you earned it, based on the time you've been on the contract. And so if you'd been there like 1 to 3 years, then you would get 2 weeks. If you've been there beyond, like, say, 3 to 5 years, then you get 3 weeks. And then if you were there from 5 to 10 years, then you would get almost 4. But if you're with a contract over 10 years, you had 5 weeks of vacation that you could accrue over a year. So at that point, the turnover rate on the contract stopped. And many of the ones that left before were able to come back and, get a job, performing a different role or sometimes even the same role. So anyway, it's always good to keep your people. Data and information assets. Public data, that's, basically data that's freely accessible to anyone, may be available via public sources such as news releases, other publications. Private data, this is internal data. It includes data on employees and customers due to its delicate nature. Personal data should be protected for fear the information may be abused, for example, for the purpose of identity theft. That's a biggie these days. Proprietary data, yeah, you want to protect that. So, if you're Colonel Sanders and, the secret recipe there, then you want to protect that, because you have you don't want to email the ingredients. And although there have been many people that claim to have figured out the recipe, and I've tasted some that said they have, and, there's some similarities, but, yet it's not the proprietary data, it's not the actual recipe. So, those important things, that you want to protect. Your facilities and supplies. Basically, you want insurance on your building. What kind of supplies do you need to run your business? What kind of building do you need to run your business? Having insurance is one of the items you always want to have, but never want to use. I bring back the old adage of, you pay car insurance, say for 10 years, and you go accident-free, no traffic tickets or violations, but yet you have that one accident, and all of a sudden your insurance goes up 30%. True story that happened to me. And so for the life of me, I'm sitting here thinking, I've been a valued customer supposedly because I'm paying in and not claiming anything. And so you're making all that profit on me, but yet I have one claim on my insurance, and all of a sudden it goes up 30%. Anyway, I didn't mean to chase that rabbit, but anyway. So basically the insurance helps recoup the cost, for replacement. And so those are always good things. So, and so basically some organizations may realize that one of their facilities is so important that it needs redundancies. And so you have the hot site, cold site, warm site. And basically a hot site is a location that can take over the operation of another location within a short period. A hot site has all the hardware, software, data needed to perform the critical functions of the original site. A hot site is also the most expensive of the 3 types. A cold site is a building with electricity and running water, but nothing else, or basically little of nothing else. You can bring your computers and data to this location and set up operation. A cold site is the least expensive of the three sites. However, it takes the longest amount of time also to set up, and it's basically the hardest to test. A warm site is a mixture of both, a compromise between the hot site and cold site. It may include the hardware, but the data may not be up to date. It may take as long as 1 or more days to implement a warm site. And so now we're going to get into identifying and evaluating the threats. Remember, a threat is any potential danger. The danger can be to the data, the hardware, or the systems. A threat assessment is the process of identifying these threats. As we mentioned before, there's the historical data. A lot of places require threat modeling. I remember when I was as an information assurance manager, one of the contractors that did the software engineering had to come up with a threat model of their product. And I was like, well, how in the world do I do that? And so I referred them to the OWASP, OWASP organization. That's what they do, is threat modeling. Also, Microsoft has a very comprehensive threat modeling procedure. And so I think what the contractor ended up doing was following the OWASP framework and guidelines. It's important to understand how threats interact with risk. So basically, all systems have vulnerabilities. You can't eliminate all vulnerabilities any more than you can eliminate all the risk. Your goal is to identify the relevant vulnerabilities. You can then choose to implement controls to reduce the weakness. And basically, not all vulnerabilities result in a loss. It's only when the threat and vulnerability come together as a threat-vulnerability pair that a loss occurs. You only need to identify and evaluate the relevant vulnerabilities. There I go, getting ahead of myself again. And so, identifying, analyzing countermeasures, in-place controls, planned controls, control categories, in place, what kind of controls do you have on your operating system? And do you have documentation that goes with it? And so the planned controls, is basically identified in planning documentation, specified implementation date. So for instance, this control will be implemented, but, it's going to take us 90 days to implement that. So you have target dates put in there for that. Control categories. The NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, they have several categories for risk assessments that you can look at, like the SP-30 Revision A, Revision 1. Is a tremendous document on risk management and how to model risk management and basically determining the low, medium, highs and, the risk factors. And so but a good site indeed, and also a very good document. So essentially, they're under the control categories. You have 3 classes, 18 families of controls, and they're grouped as procedural, technical, and physical. The procedural controls are the controls placed in response to the rules and guidelines directed by upper-level management. these are policies and procedures, security plans, insurance, personnel checks, awareness of training, rules of behavior. And then you have your technical controls, which uses computers or software to protect the system. The benefit of this control is basically 99.9% of the time it's automated. Some of the things in place, the login identifier, basically users are required to provide credentials before you can grant access to the system. Session timeout, many systems automatically time out after a period of time of inactivity. There's system logs that you can go back and look at. There's audit trails, there's input validation, there's firewalls, encryption that you can put in place. And then, of course, there's physical controls, which is controls basically the physical environment. This includes controls such as locks and guards to restrict physical access. It also includes elements to control the environment, such as heating and cooling systems. As we mentioned, locked doors, guards and access logs, video cameras, fire detection and suppression, water detection, temperature and humidity detection, and electrical grounding and circuit breakers. And so there you have your control categories. So basically, after performing an analysis, you want to, basically developing the mitigation recommendations. After performing analysis, provide specific recommendations that mitigate the risk. Then you want supporting data may include threat vulnerability pairs, like here's the threat and here's the vulnerability. But if the threat doesn't happen, then there's no vulnerability. But if the two come together, here's what we got. Basically, you want to estimate the cost and time to implement it, estimate the operational impact, and then we come back to the cost-benefit analysis. And you'll see that term throughout the semester as we go along. And so best practice for performing risk assessments is you want to ensure systems are fully described, review the past audits, review past risk assessments. As we mentioned before, if you repeat history, and sometimes if history has failed, and you continue to do what you're doing, and it was a failed process, then you're going to keep getting a failed process. Basically match the risk assessment to the management structure, and you want to identify assets within the risk assessment boundaries. We talked about the scope, and so stay on mission. Identify and evaluate relevant threats. Identify and evaluate relevant vulnerabilities. Identify and evaluate countermeasures, and then you want to track the results. So in summary, in Chapter 6, we've basically learned the definition of a risk assessment, components of risk assessments, qualitative versus quantitative risk assessment, when to perform a risk assessment, steps involved in the risk assessment, identifying assets, threats, and vulnerabilities, evaluating controls and countermeasures. But the one thing that I can leave you with, if all possible, is stay on mission. If management, upper management says this is what's important, and you want to set out your scope and say, okay, well, in our plan or our risk assessment, here's what we're going to do, and we're only going to stay within boundaries A and B, and we're not going to go to C and D and E and all these others. And so you don't want to start chasing several rabbits down different holes. So basically, stay on mission. That's the best thing that I can offer. So anyway, enjoy Lesson 3. Very important lesson as we move forward, because risk assessments will become risk management plans, and so you'll need to know a lot of these terms moving forward. And so until next lesson, I'm signing out.